Rusty froze in fear as anger welled up inside him. It was about time the others had figured things out, but now what were they going to do about it? He had hoped they'd realize the truth before morning, but clearly that had been wishful thinking. "Reckon it's good news?" the human asked, looking down at LRA perched on his shoulder. The tiny alien captain sighed. "I tried being persuasive. We'll see how far that got us." "Want a ride?" the human offered, reaching his arm down in front of LRA. "Oh yes, how chivalrous." "Thank you," LRA replied sarcastically, but she stepped onto his hand anyway and allowed herself to be lifted up to his shoulder. Despite the circumstances, she had to admit it was an efficient mode of transportation given their drastic size difference. The unlikely pair exited the holding cell with the brunt guard assigned to watch the human prisoner snapping to attention. "You shall not pass," he growled. "I am all that stands between you and the complete destruction of Dash." "We are going to pass, thank you Prior," LRA cut him off impatiently. "You're dismissed for the evening." The brunt looked scandalized at the very notion. "No, I shall accompany him wherever he may attempt to go. To the ends of the galaxy and beyond, this coveted duty I shall fulfill." LRA rolled her eyes as the guard continued to rant, his gruff voice rising in pitch. The human chuckled softly. "He sounds a lot like I used to. You have to respect that loyalty." "Let's go then," LRA said. The human stepped around the still grandstanding guard and out into the corridor. "I do not answer to the enemy." Prior blustered from behind them. "Where shall I escort the prisoner, ma'am?" LRA sighed again. So much for dismissing him. "Certainly not to the ends of the galaxy or beyond. Just down the hall, Prior. You can follow behind." The three of them navigated the windowless labyrinth that was the Ort base, Prior stomping along behind them while continuing to regale them with dire warnings about the human's untrustworthiness. LRA did her best to tune him out while the human seemed to find the whole thing rather amusing. Finally, they arrived back at the conference room where this had all started. The Zelnian officers were seated at the other end of the long table just as before, but now they looked distinctly uncomfortable at the sight of LRA perched atop the human's broad shoulder. LRA hopped down onto the table and made her way to the chair she had previously occupied while the human carefully lowered himself into the seat at the head of the table, taking special care not to accidentally break it under his significant weight. The commander stood up, the only Zelnian officer to do so, and cleared his throat awkwardly. "The board has reviewed the information that you, Captain Lizra, and your personal computer have provided," he began stiffly. "They were most concerned with the documentation you gave on how the human ships reached the Yen system. If they were truly destroyed like you claimed, then in your opinion, what is the likelihood that they are able to make a return to this galaxy?" LRA glanced at the human who seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure in the face of this inquiry about his lost people. She knew firsthand the pain and anger he still carried from that trauma. "It is possible," she said carefully. "However, statistically it is near zero. It should not be a problem for you." "How could that be?" the commander pressed. "If there is a chance they could return, then wouldn't it put us all in danger?" The human slammed a fist on the table, making everyone jump. "There's absolutely no way they're coming back," he said vehemently, glaring at the Zelnian. "You don't understand how their systems worked. If for some reason they decided to send others, they would have done so a long time ago. They don't usually send recovery missions when a ship goes dark. And even if they did come back, they wouldn't pose a galaxy-level threat. They're stuck in a single system and can't project their power outside of it." "Care to elaborate on that?" one of the other officers, Legit Tan, asked in a carefully neutral tone. The human leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I'm going to assume you read what I sent you but were unable to grasp it in its entirety. I'll word it differently this time. The human species has never been able to develop faster-than-light travel, but only because they had no particular need for it. How many planets dash? His words were cut off by a sudden commotion in the hallway outside, shouting voices and running footsteps rapidly approaching. The human and LRA exchanged an alarmed glance. The door burst open and two young Zelnian soldiers stumbled into the room, out of breath and wide-eyed with fear. But before they could get a word out, an ear-splitting screech pierced the air. The sound was like nothing any of them had ever heard before, an unearthly, grating shriek that set their teeth on edge and made their skin crawl. It seemed to go on forever, drilling into their skulls, before finally fading away into ringing silence. In the stunned aftermath, one of the young soldiers who had burst in stammered out, "See, Commander. The perimeter, it's been breached." By dash. He never got to finish his report. The far wall of the conference room suddenly exploded inward with a deafening boom, spraying debris across the room. Something huge and hideous forced its way through the gaping hole, a seething mass of teeth and claws and too many limbs. Pandemonium erupted. The Zelnians scrambled out of their seats, some fleeing for the door in blind panic while others fumbled for weapons. Pryor lunged forward to place himself between the threat and his captain with a defiant battle cry. LRA crouched frozen on the table, paralyzed by sheer terrified incomprehension of the monster before them. But the human surged to his feet with a roar of challenge and charged headlong at the thing, heedless of his complete lack of arms or armor. "No! Stop, you can't dash!" LRA cried out, certain he was about to die horribly right in front of her. But to her shock, the human slammed into the creature with bone-rattling force, grappling it back toward the breached wall. The two titans clashed in a whirlwind of violence, a frenzied blur of strikes and counterstrikes almost too fast to follow. LRA's combat-trained eyes could barely track the blistering exchange. The human's speed and power were astonishing, unbelievable. He hammered crushing blows into the thing's center mass, rocking it back, while nimbly weaving away from its slashing claws and snapping jaws. Green ichor splattered the walls and floor. "We have to help him," LRA shouted to Pryor as she shook off her paralysis. She pointed to a rack of pulse rifles on the wall. "Grab a weapon." Pryor hesitated for a split second, glancing between LRA and the raging brawl, before dashing to the gun rack to snatch two rifles. He tossed one to LRA and they took up positions, trying to line up clean shots at the writhing monster. It was all but impossible not to hit the human as well with how closely locked he was with the creature. LRA cursed under her breath, finger hovering over the trigger. She had to risk it. If they didn't find a way to bring this abomination down soon, none of them were leaving this room alive. But before she could squeeze off a shot, the human pulled off a particularly impressive combat maneuver, sacrificing his balance to seize the thing's head in both hands and wrench it violently sideways. The sharp crack of its neck snapping echoed like a gunshot and it went limp, collapsing into a twitching heap. In the ringing silence that followed, no one moved, unsure if it was truly over. The human stepped back from the corpse, breathing hard, hands dripping viridian blood. He turned to look at LRA, his expression stony. "What?" he asked in a low, dangerous voice, "the hell was that?" LRA swallowed hard, the rifle barrel wavering in her grip as her mind raced. She had never seen anything like that creature before in her life. What fresh hell had the human inadvertently dragged them all into? Before she could formulate a response, one of the Zelnian officers whimpered from his cowering position behind an overturned chair, "By the gods, look at it. Look at the size of it. And you dash," he pointed a trembling finger at the human, naked awe and fear in his bulging eyes. "You killed it. With your bare hands." The human ignored him, gaze still fixed on LRA as he awaited her explanation. She forced herself to meet that unsettling stare. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I've never encountered a species like this before. But from the coordinated way it breached our defenses, I don't think it's alone." As if summoned by her grim prediction, another hideous shriek pierced the air from somewhere deeper in the base, raising the hairs on the back of LRA's neck. Pryor tightened his grip on his rifle, mouth pressed into a thin, determined line. "Orders, Captain." LRA took a deep, steadying breath, trying to think past the fear clouding her mind. They were in uncharted territory now, facing an unknown enemy that seemed hellbent on their destruction. The safe play would be to put out a distress call, hunker down, and pray reinforcements arrived in time. But one look at the resolute human and the steel-spined Pryor changed her mind. Against all odds, the three of them had already survived one attack. If they could figure out what they were dealing with, they might just have a chance. "We need information," LRA decided, hopping down from the table with a determined set to her small shoulders. "We can't fight these things effectively until we understand what they are and where they came from." She looked up at the human towering over her. "I don't suppose your species has encountered hostile fauna like this before? Dealt with a similar incursion?" The human's expression was grim as he shook his head. "No. Humanity's experience with aliens has been limited to a handful of tentative first contacts, all peaceful. We've never seen anything like that." He gestured at the grisly remains splattered across the room. LRA's heart sank, but she pushed down her disappointment. It had been a long shot anyway. She turned to Pryor. "Private, with me. We're heading to the labs to see if the xenobiologists can tell us anything." "And you dash." "I'm coming with you," the human interrupted, tone brooking no argument. "If there are more of those things in the base, you'll need my help." LRA hesitated, torn. Part of her wanted to order him to stay put for his own safety. But she couldn't deny the combat prowess he'd just demonstrated would be invaluable if they encountered any more of the creatures. And if she was being honest with herself, his presence at her side was strangely comforting. Like having her own personal Titan bodyguard. "Fine," she relented. "But you follow my lead, understand? No charging off on your own." The human's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Aye, Captain." They crept cautiously into the corridor, LRA and Pryor sweeping their rifles in wide arcs while the human loomed behind them, ready to unleash destruction with his bare hands. The hallway was deserted, eerily quiet save for the distant wail of alarm sirens and the occasional burst of gunfire or screams. A thick, cloying stench hung in the air, like rotting meat left to putrefy in the sun. "The lab's 2 levels down," LRA said quietly, heading for the emergency stairs rather than risk taking the lift. "With any luck, they'll have gotten a specimen to study by now." But luck, it seemed, was not on their side. They emerged into a scene of utter carnage. The corridor walls were splashed liberally with blood, both red and green, and deep gouges had been carved into the metal like some great beast had tried to dig its way through. Mangled bodies in the tattered remains of lab coats lay strewn across the floor in pieces. LRA gagged and looked away, stomach heaving. Beside her, Pryor made a strangled sound of horror. Only the human seemed grimly unsurprised by the charnel house tableau. He stepped over a severed arm, eyes roving warily as he scanned for threats. What could do this? Pryor choked out. By the gods, it's like they were torn apart. Questions later, LRA said sharply, ruthlessly suppressing her own revulsion and fear. She had to stay focused, in control. Check for survivors. But it soon became sickeningly apparent that there were none to be found. They picked their way through the ravaged lab in tense silence, the cloying reek of death thick enough to choke on. Overturned exam tables, shattered equipment, and bullet-riddled containment units painted a portrait of panicked last stands. They found a few more bodies, or rather, parts of bodies. But no answers. Until the human called out softly, "Captain. Over here." LRA and Pryor hurried over to find him crouched next to the eviscerated remnants of one of the lead xenobiologists. Her ravaged face was frozen in a rictus of agony and terror, sightless eyes staring at the harsh fluorescent lights above. The human wasn't looking at the body, though. His gaze was fixed on the datapad still clutched in her blood-slicked hand. He carefully pried it loose, wiping a smear of crimson from the spiderwebbed screen. What is it? Did she manage to record something before? LRA couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. In response, the human tapped the flickering display. A woman's voice, high and frantic with barely leashed hysteria, crackled from the speakers. Everywhere. They're coming out of the goddamn walls. Stun rounds, kinetic impact, even plasma doesn't slow them down. We've never seen anything like them, no recognizable biology, unprecedented regenerative abilities. They're not just killing us, they're gathering the bodies, dragging them away like meat. Why? What do they want? Wait, no, stay back. I said stay BA-. The recording cut off with a burst of static and a liquid gurgle that made LRA's skin crawl. The human switched off the datapad and stood, expression carefully blank. Well. I think we found our answers, Captain. LRA drew in a shaky breath and nodded once, firmly. Not all of them. But enough to know we're dealing with something far beyond our experience. We still don't know where they came from, or their purpose here beyond killing us. More importantly, we don't know how to stop them. Bullets and plasma are useless. So what's the plan? Pryor asked quietly. We're outmatched here, ma'am. Should we try to evacuate while we still can? Get word to High Command? LRA was silent for a long moment, mind racing. The smart, logical play was retreat. Cut their losses, abandon the base, and hope at least a few of them could escape to warn the galaxy about this new existential threat. But she looked up at the human looming beside her, still as a mountain, and saw something in those fathomless gray eyes that gave her pause. A glimmer of fear, yes, but overwhelmed by the implacable resolve of a being who had already faced the unimaginable and come out the other side. He would not run from this fight. And God's help her, neither would she. No, LRA said at last, surprised by the calm steel in her own voice. We stay. We fight. And we find a way to kill these things before there's nothing left. The human studied her for a long moment before inclining his head in solemn approval. I'm with you, Captain. To whatever end. Pryor swallowed audibly but raised his chin and nodded as well. Ready. LRA felt a sudden swell of fierce pride in her small, brave crew. Against all odds, thrown together by the cruel whims of fate, they had forged an unbreakable bond in the crucible of this nightmare. She would not have chosen anyone else to face hell itself alongside. Right then, she said briskly, squaring her shoulders. We need to regroup with any other survivors, see what resources we have left. Weapons, defenses, anything that might give us an edge. Private Pryor, you know this base better than anyone. Thoughts? Pryor's brow furrowed as he mentally reviewed the sprawling map of the complex. The armory would be the obvious choice, but it's on the other side of the base. We'd have to fight our way through unknowable enemy numbers to reach it, with no guarantee it hasn't already been overrun. LRA nodded grimly, having come to the same conclusion herself. Other options? The emergency security bunker at the heart of the base, Pryor replied after a moment. Reinforced blast doors, independent power and life support systems, hardline comms to summon reinforcements. If I were a betting man, that's where I'd say any survivors would hole up. Agreed, LRA said. She glanced at the human. Thoughts? He shrugged his massive shoulders. You're the captain. I'll follow your lead. But I don't like the idea of getting boxed in, no matter how secure this bunker is supposed to be. We still don't know the full capabilities of these things. For all we know, they could melt through the walls like acid. LRA suppressed a shudder at the thought but inclined her head in acknowledgement of his point. Noted. But I don't think we have much choice. We can't hope to fight off a coordinated assault, not without knowing their weak points. Our best bet is to fortify our position and try to learn more about what we're up against. Decision made, she hefted her rifle and jerked her chin at Pryor. Lead the way, Private. Stay sharp and check your corners. We move quick and quiet. They set off in a cautious advance down the blood-splattered corridor, senses straining for any hint of movement in the oppressive gloom. The emergency lighting flickered erratically, casting writhing shadows on the walls that set LRA's nerves on edge. She half expected a monster to come lunging out of every doorway they passed. But the only sounds were their own muffled footsteps and ragged breathing, the distant wail of alarms, and the intermittent rattle of gunfire that seemed to be coming from all directions at once. The base had become a labyrinth of horrors, a twisting gauntlet of death with no way to know which path led to salvation and which to damnation. They descended deeper into the bowels of the complex, following Pryor's lead through eerily deserted maintenance tunnels and service corridors that bypassed the main arteries. The private moved with the swift surety of one who had patrolled these halls countless times, never faltering even as the carnage around them grew more visceral and widespread. After an interminable, nerve-shredding span of navigating the claustrophobic maze, Pryor finally raised a fist to signal a halt outside a nondescript hatchway. "We're here," he said quietly, voice echoing oddly in the confined space. "Emergency bunker is just beyond this pressure door." LRA eyed the featureless metal barrier with trepidation, exchanging a loaded glance with the equally grim-faced human. There was no telling what fresh nightmares might await them on the other side. But they had come too far to turn back now. Steeling herself, LRA reached out to palm the access panel. Only to flinch back with a startled curse as a sudden burst of panicked shouts and sporadic weapons fire erupted from the room beyond. The unmistakable sounds of desperate battle, of terror and agony, muffled but still piercingly clear through the inches of reinforced steel. "Help us! By the gods, someone help us! They're here, they're inside the bunker. No, no, get back, get dash." The transmission cut off abruptly in a welter of wet, tearing sounds and agonized screams that raised the hair on the back of LRA's neck. In the ringing silence that followed, no one moved, unsure of what fresh hell awaited them. Then the human stepped forward, gently but firmly moving LRA aside to stand before the pressure door. His expression was calm, almost serene, but she saw the way his massive hands flexed at his sides, the coiled tension in his broad shoulders. "Ready for war. I understand if you want to wait out here, Captain," he said quietly without looking at her. "No shame in it. This isn't your fight." LRA barked a humorless laugh, surprising herself with the ice-cold resolve crystallizing in her veins. "Isn't it? Those are my people in there, soldier. Zelnian or otherwise, I'll be damned if I abandon them to face this horror alone." She hefted her rifle and nodded to Pryor, who swallowed hard but stepped up on the human's other side, squaring his shoulders. "We're with you. To whatever end." Something like respect, perhaps even admiration, flickered in the human's eyes as he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "To whatever end," he echoed solemnly. Then he turned back to the pressure door, drew in a deep breath, and punched the access panel with all his might, ripping it clean out of the wall in a shower of sparks. The barrier slammed open with a screech of protesting metal to reveal a scene straight out of the most visceral horror vid. The cramped confines of the emergency bunker had become an abattoir, every surface splashed liberally with blood and viscera. Mangled corpses sprawled in heaps where they had fallen, sightless eyes frozen wide with terror. And in the center of the charnel house tableau, three of the monsters crouched over the ravaged bodies of Zelnian soldiers, long barbed tongues lashing out to snare gobbets of bloody flesh and draw them back into fang-filled maws that split their faces nearly in half. They whipped around at the intrusion with shrieks of rage, multiple eyes flashing with malevolent hunger as they sighted new prey. Clawed limbs coiled beneath them, powerful haunches bunching in preparation to lunge. But the human was already moving, a blur of speed and lethal intent. He hit the lead creature like a meteor strike, batting aside its slashing talons to slam a thunderous fist into center mass with a wet crack of splintering bone. The other two monsters split to flank him with blinding speed, coming in low and fast from the sides. But LRA and Pryor were hot on the human's heels, rifles thundering as they poured plasma fire into the fray. One of the beasts took a trio of bolts to the head and reeled back with an agonized howl, ichor spraying from its ruined eyes. The other jerked and spasmed as a sustained burst stitched a line of craters up its sinuous length, but kept coming with single-minded ferocity. Pryor dove out of the way of its bull rush at the last second, hitting the deck in a frantic roll and coming up firing point-blank into its face. The creature shrieked as searing bolts took it full in its gaping maw, blasting out the back of its skull in a geyser of bone and brain matter. LRA meanwhile zeroed in on the still-thrashing monster blinded by her opening salvo, aiming for center mass to put it down for good. Her rifle chuffed and kicked in her hands as she poured plasma into the beast's barrel chest, but incredibly, impossibly, the wounds sealed over almost as soon as they were made, flesh knitting back together before her disbelieving eyes. "Captain!" Pryor shouted in warning, but too late. The monster lashed out with preternatural accuracy for a blind creature, a massive taloned paw swiping out to catch LRA full across the torso. The force of the blow slammed her back against the bunker wall like a rag doll, rifle flying from her nerveless fingers as she felt something give way in her chest with an agonizing crack. Distantly, through the gray haze of pain, she heard the human roar in fury. Blinking back stars, she watched him redouble his efforts against the creature he was grappling, hammering at it with pile-driver blows as he tried to fight his way clear to reach her. But the monster was too fast, too strong, even for him. It caught his fist in its claws and wrenched with savage force, the sickening pop of dislocating bone terribly loud in the confined space. The human screamed through clenched teeth, going down on one knee as the beast bore him backward. Pryor lunged to help with a defiant battle cry, slamming the butt of his rifle into the monster's head again and again. But it was like trying to batter down a brick wall. The creature shrugged off the blows with contemptuous ease, backhanding the private with a casual swipe that sent him crashing into a bank of mangled equipment consoles. Leaving LRA alone. Broken and bleeding, propped up against the wall like a discarded toy soldier. She scrabbled desperately for her rifle with the arm that didn't feel shattered, dragging it into her lap with a pained gasp. The monster loomed over her, its hideous face filling her swimming vision. This close, she could see its skin was a nightmare tapestry of scars and partially healed bullet wounds. Mementos from how many other desperate last stands? How many gallant but ultimately futile attempts to deny this apex predator its bloody due? Enraged by its injuries, it drew back its massive clawed hand with a rattling hiss, preparing to dash her brains out against the gore-slicked wall. LRA stared up at it, vision narrowing to that promise of imminent violent death. And behind it, impossibly, a flicker of movement. A familiar mountain of a silhouette, rising unsteadily to his feet behind the creature. Clutching his ruined arm to his chest, the human bent to scoop up a twisted shard of metal in his good hand, his grim features set in a mask of determination and pain. The monster tensed to strike, its killing blow arcing towards LRA's head. And the human stepped up behind it and rammed the jagged metal spear up under its chin with all his strength, punching through its brain pan and out the top of its skull in a spray of bone and ichor. The creature convulsed, impaled on the improvised spear, arms windmilling. It screamed, a high, ululating cry of shock and rage, and then, finally, it shuddered and went limp, dead weight sagging to the deck as the human let it slip free. In the sudden, ringing silence, LRA could only stare as the human slumped back against the opposite wall and slid slowly to the floor, cradling his mangled arm. He met her gaze from across the body-choked bunker, his eyes glassy with pain but still alight with that same fathomless resolve. "I think," he said mildly, coughing wetly and spitting out a glob of blood, "that we may need a new plan, Captain." Despite it all, the terror, the pain, the soul-deep weariness, LRA found herself barking a ragged laugh. You think? Pryor groaned from somewhere in the wreckage, the sound startling a brittle smile from her. They were alive. Not whole, perhaps not hale, but still here. Still fighting. And in that moment, battered but unbowed in the face of nightmares made flesh, LRA dared to hope that might just be enough. In the aftermath of the bloody skirmish, LRA, the human, and Pryor took a precious few minutes to tend to their wounds and regroup, scavenging what meager supplies they could from the ravaged bunker. The amount of equipment and potential weapons that had been destroyed during the siege was disheartening, but they cannibalized what they could, mostly ammo and a few spare energy cells to recharge the drained rifles. The human located a rudimentary medkit and managed to fashion a crude sling for his dislocated arm, face tight with pain as LRA helped him immobilize the limb against his chest. "It's okay, Captain," he reassured her through gritted teeth when she winced in sympathy at his stifled groan. "I've had worse. And I can still fight with the other hand." LRA didn't doubt that for a moment. As she looked around at the grisly scene, the bodies of the fallen scattered like broken dolls, the scorch marks and blood spatters painting the walls, the twisted wreckage of their last bastion, she felt a swell of grim determination settle like a lead weight in her gut. They might be bloodied and battered, but they weren't beaten. Not yet. And if they were going down, they'd damn well go down swinging. "Any bright ideas on what we do now?" Pryor asked quietly, looking up from field dressing a deep gash on his thigh. "I'm all for taking the fight to these ugly bastards, but we can't exactly go toe-to-toe with them." "No," LRA agreed, mind racing as she tried to break down the situation logically. "But now we know their weakness, they can't rapidly regenerate trauma to the brain. A headshot puts them down for good." "Great. So we need to either find a stockpile of anti-material rifles, or get close enough to make our shots count," Pryor said sardonically. "Piece of cake." LRA shook her head, the beginnings of an idea starting to coalesce. "We don't need to kill them all. We just need to kill enough to get to the control room and send out a distress call. If we can summon reinforcements, we might be able to turn the tide." The human stirred, catching her gaze. In the dim emergency lighting, his eyes were fathomless pits, but she could read the calculation in them clear as day. "It's a long shot. The control room is clear on the other side of the base, and there's no telling how many of those things are between us and it. Not to mention whatever else they've got lurking." "I'm open to alternatives," LRA said dryly. "But unless you've got a nuke tucked away somewhere." "Fresh out, I'm afraid. Must have left it in my other pants." The human huffed a humorless chuckle, then winced as the motion jostled his arm. "All right, distress call it is. But I think we need to split up." LRA blinked, thrown. "Come again?" The human gestured around the bunker with his good hand. "Look, Captain, this base has been compromised 6 ways from Sunday. We have to assume they've got control of security, surveillance, all of it. They probably already know we're here." A chill slid down LRA's spine at the implications. "So what are you suggesting?" "A diversion. I'll take the most direct route to the control room, make a lot of noise, draw as many of them to me as I can. Meanwhile, you and Pryor use the service tunnels to slip around behind, come at it from the flank." LRA opened her mouth to protest the sheer suicidal insanity of this plan, and then closed it as the cold, brutal logic sank in. The human was right. One of them had to be the bait, the sacrificial lion, if the others were to have any chance of reaching their goal. And with his size and strength, his ability to go hand-to-hand with the monsters and hold his own, he was the only logical choice. She hated it with every fiber of her being, but there was no denying the truth of it. "I don't like this," she said at last, hating the way her voice wavered. "Even for you, it's too much to ask. Too much to expect you to face them alone." Something flickered in the human's expression, there and gone too fast to parse. I won't be alone, Captain. You'll be with me, every step. Fighting at my side, even if I can't see you. He offered a faint, crooked smile. Frankly, I can't think of anyone else I'd rather have watching my back. Elari swallowed around the sudden lump in her throat and nodded jerkily. Likewise, soldier. Pryor glanced between them, then cleared his throat gruffly. Right then. Let's hash out the details. Time's wasting. It didn't take long to sketch out the broad strokes.